Hi, it's Pastor Andy with our Tuesday video this week, and many people have debated, theologians, etc., have debated over the years whether or what it means, if Paul is making any distinction between the idea of being conformed and or transformed. He says, "Do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And so, a lot of people have made this distinction that the conformity is from the outside and the transformation is from the inside. And that's certainly reasonable. Paul does say not to be transformed to this world, or that word might better be translated age in this case, which certainly would mean not to give in to the pressures that come from this world and allow the world to form you to its image. It would kind of be like Jell-O that you were pouring into something, and there was like a mold there that was going to shape that Jell-O. So you would pour the liquid fluid in there and just allow it to harden over time. And when it was hardened, as much as Jell-O would harden, as it was hardened, it would be in a particular shape of something. But on the other hand, it's easy for certain to see that transform would mean something internally, because Paul mentions that it is the mind that needs to be transformed. Now, the mind is not the brain. The brain is an organ within what we call our head, inside and protected by the skull. But the mind represents what the brain does. Largely, it represents our thoughts, it represents our memories, it's a part of our imagination, but it even goes so far as to be a part of expressing our emotions. And certainly, as Paul is talking about here, it reflects our decision making. So naturally, it would make sense to allow, from Paul's perspective, and therefore from the perspective of those who want to follow God, to allow God to transform the mind. It's nothing we can do, but God can. Now, one of the challenges in understanding this conform versus transform idea is, you might recall in Romans 8:29 that Paul wrote that God's desire is to conform us to the image of His Son. And when we think of image, we think of external, but really He's not talking about making us look like Jesus on the outside. He's talking about making us become like Jesus from the inside out. And so we might think, well, let's just, if that's the same word, can we get some draw from that? But the problem is in the English word is the same, but the underlying Greek word is not. And so we can't use that word to make any kind of parallel between Romans 8:29 and 12:2. But we can look, and by the way, that's the only time those two words are used in Scripture. But we can find a couple of other instances of the word transformed in Scripture. One is in Mark 9:2 when it says that Jesus was transfigured. And so from the inside out, it wasn't that He was just on the outside, He was glowing or whatever that looked like in that moment. It was all of Him. It was His insides, outsides, and everything that had been transformed, or as the term is used by Mark, transfigured. The other time that it is used is in 2 Corinthians 3:18, also by Paul, when Paul wrote that we, as believers, are being transformed into a different type of glory. And so what we have and who we are now is not where we need to be, and so God is transforming us into a particular type of glory, almost like a new level, if you will. So we may not really be able to understand if there should be a distinction between conformed and transformed, but and whether conformed should be considered from an inward perspective or from an outward perspective. But what we can say is this: transformation always starts from within, and inward change will lead to outward behavior change. But the inverse is not true. Just because we change the outside does not mean that we are changed on the inside. And so what is important here is that regardless of how we view the idea of being conformed, whether inwardly or outwardly, the inclusion of being transformed by God is important. It is about the world and how we respond within the world, but it is about our mind and how our mind reacts to that. Because ultimately, God is not interested in behavior modification. You may say, well, wait a minute, Andy, he is. No, he's interested in us. If we merely conform to the expectation of others, then that means that we could be reformed at a later point to a different set of expectations to a different group of people. But if we are truly transformed, which only God can do, then we are changed from the inside out, and what happens on the outside of us is a reflection of what has happened on the inside of us. Thus, transformation is the type of change within us that lasts, because it is from God. And transforming does change us. It doesn't just change what we do. Now, certainly, what we do might change greatly. But if that is true, it's because of who we are and who we are becoming. And that's God's real interest. As I've said before, Jesus did not die to make bad people good. He died to make dead people alive. And that is what true transformation is. So may we be a people who are being conformed, outwardly, inwardly, doesn't matter, or transformed, I should say, day by day, in our mind, in our body, and in our spirit.